These are 3 great exercises for pure beginners in programming that want to learn how to use for loops. And not just that, for any beginner that actually wants to see how to use for loops in a very simple exercise, we'll do that for them. So in our first exercise, we want to literally draw a grid that a user can kind of choose the rows and columns, so they get to decide how this grid will look like. So we'll start with our code. Call the first variable just first. We'll make it an integer, because the user is going to choose a number of our rows for grid. So input, and then we'll practically do the same thing for columns. We'll rename the variable into second and row into column. So this part of the code will ask the user to input the values. So now we want a variable that will define what will be the drawing block of our grid, and we'll just choose star sign. And then we want kind of like the formula, which will be the drawing function of our program. So it will be as simple as a second variable multiplied by our symbol variable, which is sign. So these are all the values we need. And now we will create the for loop. So in order for this grid to be drawn in Python, we need to create a for loop that will take these values and do it a certain number of times. So we will create a for I, so for each element in range of the column number. And we will put a nested conditional statement saying that if the column number, sorry, this should be row number. So if the column number is greater than 0, then print column. Sorry, print column. So our formula. So for every element in the range of the row number, and if the column number is greater than 0, we want Python to print for this many times to print this formula, which is column number times this symbol. So let's see what we have. Let's go to our output and we run the code, enter your row number, and it's 5, and column number 3, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 3 columns. So it does what it's supposed to do, and we will move on onto our second exercise. For our second exercise, we want to create a program that will take a certain amount of numbers and add them all up. But we want to use a for loop to then pick numbers that are positive and negative, separate them, and add them together as a separate positive and negative sum. So we will start by creating an empty list, and then I will pass a variable called number of elements, just to make it easy for remembering. Asking the user to choose how many integers do they want to add up. So how many numbers do they actually want to add up all together. So this will ask the user for the number of elements to be added up. And now we start with our first for loop, and it will be for every element in range of number of elements. So this is the variable we just passed. Basically, the input that the user gives here will be stored in this variable, number of elements. So now our for loop is going to take the number of elements here because it's the range of these elements. So new variable called elements. Again, asking the user to enter their number and press enter, so they can continue entering the numbers that they want to add up. So now we will use an inbuilt function that will append any answer in this question will be stored in this variable called elements. And this function will append each of these numbers into a variable called elements. So that's the first part of our program. In the second part, we want to create 2 empty lists. One list will be for our positive numbers, and the second list will be for our negative numbers. So first, with our empty lists, and then for the positive numbers. So you will see later why we need these lists to be empty, because the for loops are actually going to fill these lists using the append method. So now with our second for loop, for every element in list. So if you remember earlier when we made an empty list literally at the beginning of writing, so now we are choosing to write for every element in list nested conditional statement if that element is less than 0, which means it's going to be a negative. If that element is a number smaller, less than a 0, automatically that's a negative number. So we want to append it into the list of negative numbers, the empty list we just created earlier, as you can see. So for every element in our previous list, if that element is smaller than 0, we're going to write a function that will append that number into our empty list called negative numbers. So we choose append that element. And another conditional statement nested into this for loop is going to be if that element is greater than 0, then we want to append it into our number of positive. So that should be all when it comes to the actual program. All we need now is print sum of the positive integers, and we will use the pre-built function sum so that it just basically calculates the sum of the numbers in our positive numbers list. And we'll basically do the same for negative. And we will just change this bit so it's our negative numbers. So that should be all. So now let's move into our output and see what we get. So we run our program, choose how many integers you want to add up. Let's choose 5. And we'll start putting in our numbers. So 5 minus 3, 5 minus 6, and 3. So the sum of the positive integers is 13 and sum of the negative integers is minus 9. So our program works as intended. Moving on to the third and the last exercise for today, we are going to take the first exercise and make it a little bit more complicated, a little bit more interesting. So if you remember, we were drawing a grid with a for loop. This time we'll be drawing a diamond and the user will be able to choose what kind of diamond they want. So let's do that. Just like previously, we will choose a sign that we use to create the diamond. So our star, and this will be our height variable, asking the user to input how high do they want their diamond to be. And to specify it a bit more, these are some instructions for the user. So now we need some conditional statements to reinforce what we specify to the user here. So we'll use some if height is greater or equal than 40, then print invalid amount greater than 40. So we want to make our program a little bit smarter so it's able to recognize if the value input is greater than 40. Elif height is smaller or equal to, then print invalid amount less than 2. And if none of these two conditions are met, which means that they have inputted the desired amount, which is more than 2 and no more than 40, we can put that in. Else, if none of the above happen, then simply do this. And now we will use the for loop in order to have this diamond written. So it will be for x in range of height, print, and now we will make it neat and sensible. Height minus the variable of element star sign times a little bit of math now, 2 times the elements plus 1. And now we'll write for x, which is the each element in range of height minus 2, minus 1, and minus 1 again, print, and basically the same thing like above, times height minus the element, star sign, times the same math as above. 2 times element times 1. So that should be it. So let's go to our output and see what we have. So we're gonna run our code, enter your desired diamond height. So let's say we want 5, and we have a lovely diamond. If we try to run it again and we choose 25, we have a bigger and equally aesthetically pleasing diamond. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this short and very useful exercises for people who are coming across for loops for the first time. You get to see a practical example of how you can use for loops. And this should also help you to kind of understand the logic of loops in programming and hopefully make it easier whilst you go on to study while loops. Thank you for watching, and I see you next time.